You're telling me a bunch of farmers found what the FBI couldn't locate for 70 years? The words cut through the humid Tennessee air as federal agents swarmed the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, their expensive suits contrasting sharply with the rural law enforcement officers who'd been guarding the most valuable discovery in American history. What started as a routine pond drainage on the struggling Hartwell family farm had unearthed the 1943 military transport plane containing $90 million worth of uncut diamonds, a cargo manifest that didn't officially exist, and evidence of a wartime conspiracy that had baffled intelligence agencies for decades. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The discovery had sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C., where classified files suddenly became relevant again, and powerful people who thought their secrets were buried forever began making frantic phone calls. But what the federal agents didn't know was that in the small farming community of Millbrook, Tennessee, a disabled combat veteran named Marcus Hartwell and his sharp-eyed teenage son, Tyler, had been quietly solving mysteries that PhD historians and professional treasure hunters had declared impossible to crack. Sometimes, the most extraordinary discoveries happen when ordinary people refuse to accept that the truth is too buried to find. The morning had started like any other on the Hartwell family farm, with Marcus surveying the 100-acre property that had been in his family for 4 generations, but was now facing foreclosure after 3 consecutive years of crop failures and mounting medical bills from his combat injuries. The old pond that sat in the farm's northeast corner had been a source of irrigation for decades, but recent drought conditions had reduced it to a stagnant, algae-covered eyesore that served no practical purpose except reminding Marcus of better times when the farm had been profitable. His son Tyler, 17 and brilliant in the way that often made adults uncomfortable, had been advocating for draining the pond for months, arguing that the land underneath could be converted to more productive agricultural use. At 6'2", with the kind of analytical mind that saw patterns where others saw only problems, Tyler possessed an intuitive understanding of systems and logistics that reminded Marcus painfully of his own younger self before combat injuries and family responsibilities had redirected his life towards simpler survival. "Dad, if we're going to lose the farm anyway, we might as well try something different," Tyler had said over breakfast, his voice carrying the practical wisdom that had emerged from watching his family struggle with financial pressures that seemed to worsen each month. "That pond hasn't held decent water in 2 years, and the soil underneath might be fertile enough to support cash crops that could help with the mortgage payments." Marcus had nodded absently, his attention divided between Tyler's logical arguments and the stack of overdue notices that had arrived with the morning mail. The Veterans Administration disability payments covered basic living expenses, but they were nowhere near sufficient to maintain a working farm that required constant investment in equipment, seed, fertilizer, and the 1,000 other costs that transformed rural land into productive agricultural enterprise. The farm had been profitable when Marcus's father ran it, back when small-scale agriculture could compete with industrial farming operations, and when community banks understood that farming was a long-term investment rather than a quarterly profit center. But corporate agriculture had changed everything, driving down commodity prices while increasing production costs until family farms became financial impossibilities for all but the most efficient or most subsidized operations. Marcus's military service had been supposed to provide skills and benefits that would help him modernize the farm after his discharge. But 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with chronic pain, mobility limitations, and the kind of hypervigilance that made peaceful farm work feel like an inadequate response to problems that required more aggressive solutions. The transition from military precision to agricultural patience had been more difficult than anyone had warned him it would be. "We'll need to rent drainage equipment," Marcus said finally, accepting Tyler's proposal despite his reservations about spending money they couldn't afford on projects that might not produce immediate returns. But if we're going to do this, we do it right. Complete drainage, soil analysis, and proper preparation for whatever crops we decide to plant. Tyler's face lit up with the kind of excitement that made Marcus remember why he'd fought so hard. To return home safely, why preserving the family farm mattered more than simple economics or practical considerations. His son represented the fourth generation of Hartwells to work this land, and Marcus was determined that financial difficulties wouldn't be the reason that continuity ended on his watch. The pond drainage project began on a Tuesday morning, late September, when the Tennessee heat was finally beginning to moderate, and the autumn planting season offered possibilities for crops that could mature before winter frost. Marcus had rented a diesel-powered pump from the county equipment cooperative, along with hoses and fittings that would allow them to divert the pond water into irrigation channels that could benefit the farm's remaining productive acreage. Tyler had approached the project with characteristic thoroughness, researching drainage techniques and soil preparation methods with the kind of systematic attention that had made him valedictorian of his high school class despite the distractions of family financial stress. His college acceptance letters sat on his desk like beautiful impossibilities, full scholarships to engineering programs that he couldn't accept because his family needed his help with the farm. The water levels dropped about 4 feet, Tyler reported after the first day of pumping, his notebook filled with measurements and observations that documented every aspect of the drainage process. But there's something weird about the bottom contours. The depth isn't consistent with natural pond formation, and there are straight lines that suggest some kind of artificial structure. Marcus joined his son at the pond's edge, his military training automatically engaging as he studied the partially exposed bottom through water that was clearer than it had been in years. What Tyler had identified as straight lines did, indeed, appear to be geometric rather than natural, suggesting human construction or intervention that predated their family's ownership of the property. Could be an old foundation, Marcus suggested, though his experience with aerial reconnaissance made him suspect that the shapes were too regular and too large to represent typical rural construction. This property changed hands several times. During the 1940s, before my grandfather bought it, previous owners might have built something that got flooded when the pond was created. The second day of drainage revealed more anomalies that challenged simple explanations. As the water level continued dropping, Tyler's measurements showed depth variations that suggested a large object rather than architectural remains. The straight lines he'd observed were actually edges of something metallic that reflected sunlight, differently than natural sediment or typical construction materials. "Dad, I think there's something buried down there," Tyler said, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who'd learned to manage expectations, but couldn't completely suppress curiosity about mysteries that demanded investigation. The metal signatures are too big to be farm equipment, and they're positioned in ways that don't match any agricultural use patterns. Marcus felt the familiar combination of skepticism and interest that had served him well during military intelligence work, the need to gather more information before drawing conclusions that might prove embarrassing or dangerous. But Tyler's observations were methodical and documented, suggesting genuine anomalies rather than wishful thinking or adolescent imagination. "We'll keep draining and see what emerges," Marcus decided. "But we document everything carefully and involve authorities if we find anything that looks like it might be significant. I'm not interested in legal complications that could make our financial situation even worse." The third day brought revelations that transformed routine farm improvement into historical discovery. With only 2 feet of water remaining in the pond, the outline of what was unmistakably an aircraft became visible through the murky liquid that had concealed it for decades. The wings, fuselage, and tail section were intact but partially buried in sediment that had accumulated over years of agricultural runoff and natural decomposition. Tyler stood at the pond's edge with his notebook, sketching the aircraft's configuration with the precision that had impressed his engineering teachers and worried his parents in equal measure. His drawings showed a twin-engine design consistent with military transport aircraft from the 1940s, complete enough to suggest that the crash had been relatively controlled rather than catastrophic. "It's a Douglas C-47, Tyler announced after comparing his sketches to aircraft identification guides he'd downloaded to his phone. World War II-era military transport, probably carrying cargo rather than passengers based on the way it's sitting in the sediment. But what would a military aircraft be doing over Tennessee farmland in the 1940s? Marcus studied the aircraft with growing unease, his military experience suggesting possibilities that went beyond simple navigation errors or mechanical failures. Military transport aircraft followed specific routes and carried specific cargoes, neither of which should have brought them over rural Tennessee unless something had gone very wrong with official plans. "We need to stop the drainage and contact authorities immediately," Marcus said, understanding that aircraft discoveries involved federal jurisdiction and potential legal complications that small-town farming families were not equipped to handle independently. "This is evidence of a historical event that probably has family members somewhere still wondering what happened to the crew." But Tyler's attention had been caught by something else, a detail that transformed historical curiosity into potential financial salvation. Through the remaining water, he could see cargo containers that had spilled from the aircraft's damaged hold, their military markings still visible after 70 years of submersion. One container had opened, revealing contents that reflected light in ways that suggested something far more valuable than typical military supplies. "Dad," Tyler said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled shock that preceded life-changing revelations, "I think we need to see what's in those cargo containers before we call anyone. Because if I'm right about what I'm seeing, this discovery could solve all our financial problems, and a lot of other people's problems too." Marcus approached the water's edge, following his son's gaze toward cargo containers that had been preserved by decades of submersion in the pond's protective environment. What he saw made him understand why Tyler's voice had carried such careful excitement, why their routine farm improvement project had suddenly become something that would attract attention from people whose interests went far beyond agricultural productivity. The spilled cargo wasn't military supplies or personal effects from the aircraft's crew. It was diamonds, raw and uncut, scattered across the pond bottom like some impossible treasure that had been waiting 70 years for the right family to discover it at exactly the moment when discovery could mean the difference between losing everything and securing their future. As Marcus stared at the fortune that lay beneath the remaining pond water, he realized that their drainage project had uncovered more than historical artifacts or valuable gems. They had found evidence of a story that someone had gone to great lengths to bury, involving people who had risked everything to transport cargo that officially didn't exist to destinations that weren't recorded in any military logs. The Hartwell family farm, which had seemed destined for foreclosure and failure, had suddenly become the center of a mystery that connected their small Tennessee community to events that had shaped American history in ways that no official records acknowledged. But claiming their discovery would require navigating legal, historical, and potentially dangerous complications that could either secure their family's future or destroy everything they'd worked to preserve. Marcus Hartwell's weathered hands gripped his morning coffee as he watched Tyler arrange detailed sketches of the submerged aircraft across their kitchen table, the same table where 3 generations of Hartwells had made decisions that shaped the farm's destiny. The ceramic mug bore the faded insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division, a reminder of the brotherhood Marcus had left behind when combat injuries forced his early retirement and returned to civilian struggles that seemed mundane compared to military challenges but somehow felt more personally threatening. Now, Their cramped farmhouse kitchen served as command center for the most significant discovery in Tennessee history, where a disabled veteran who'd once coordinated complex military operations was learning to navigate civilian mysteries that involved federal agencies, historical conspiracies, and enough uncut diamonds to transform their family's economic circumstances forever. The aircraft identification guides spread across the table showed technical specifications for Douglas C-47 transport planes, but none of the official documentation explained what military cargo would have included millions of dollars worth of precious stones. Tyler possessed an intuitive understanding of historical research and investigative methodology that had impressed his advanced placement teachers while worrying his father about the kind of curiosity that could lead a 17-year-old into dangerous territory. At 6'2", with analytical skills that bypassed formal education entirely, Tyler approached complex problems with systematic thinking that reminded Marcus of intelligence officers who'd saved lives by seeing patterns that others missed. "Look at this flight path analysis, Dad," Tyler explained, his young voice carrying the precision that had earned him early admission to 3 different engineering programs he couldn't afford to attend. If this C-47 was following standard military routes in 1943, it should have been nowhere near Tennessee. Either it was severely off course, or it was flying a mission that wasn't documented in official records. Marcus marveled at his son's ability to transform historical research into practical investigation, using online databases and military archives to reconstruct events that had been classified or deliberately obscured for 7 decades. Tyler's informal education in problem-solving had given him perspectives that formal academic training sometimes overlooked, the ability to see inconsistencies that suggested deeper mysteries requiring investigation. What happens when systems are operating outside their normal parameters? Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from Tyler while remembering similar conversations with fellow veterans about missions that hadn't matched official briefings. These kitchen discussions had become sacred time since Tyler's mother died, moments when the weight of medical bills and mortgage payments couldn't intrude on the shared joy of discovery between father and son. "Everything becomes improvised instead of planned," Tyler replied, adjusting one of his sketches so the aircraft's position aligned with geographical surveys he'd downloaded from county records. "Like an operation where everyone's following different orders instead of coordinated objectives. The cargo manifest doesn't match the flight path, the destination doesn't match the mission parameters, and the timeline doesn't match any documented military activities in this region." Marcus nodded, remembering similar inconsistencies from intelligence briefings, where official explanations didn't account for observable evidence. His late wife had been a military historian who believed that the most important discoveries emerged from investigating discrepancies rather than accepting institutional narratives. Her research notebook still sitting on their bookshelf like historical scripture, containing insights about military operations that had been classified or deliberately misrepresented. "Your mother would have loved this mystery," Marcus said softly, reaching across to adjust a photograph that had shifted out of alignment. "She always said that the most significant historical events were the ones that didn't appear in official records because someone had gone to great lengths to ensure they remained secret." "I know," Tyler replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance that had become part of their daily lives since losing the family's historian and emotional anchor. "That's why I want to understand everything about this aircraft before we involve federal authorities. I want to document the complete story about what happened here, not just the parts that official investigations decide to acknowledge." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he considered the financial implications of their discovery. The college tuition that Tyler's scholarships would cover if they could afford the living expenses, and the medical bills that continued arriving despite his wife's death 3 years earlier. The Veterans Administration disability payments provided basic survival, but they were nowhere near sufficient for the kind of opportunities that Tyler's exceptional abilities deserved. "We'll figure out the legal requirements, son," Marcus said, the familiar reassurance coming easily despite the stack of foreclosure warnings hidden in his desk drawer. "You're brilliant enough to earn full scholarships, and by the time you're ready for college, we'll have resolved whatever complications this discovery creates." Their conversation was interrupted by the harsh ring of Marcus's cell phone, displaying Sheriff Rebecca Martinez's number. At 55, Sheriff Martinez had maintained order in Riverside County, with the practical wisdom of someone who'd learned that every situation carried hidden complications, especially when they involved federal jurisdiction and historical mysteries. That attracted attention from agencies whose authority superseded local law enforcement. "Marcus, I need you and Tyler to meet me at the farm immediately." Sheriff Martinez's voice carried the strain of someone delivering news that would complicate lives that were already difficult enough. "We've got a situation that requires your particular expertise, but it's not the kind of problem we usually handle in rural Tennessee." "What kind of situation?" Marcus asked, noting the careful way Sheriff Martinez chose her words while understanding that their aircraft discovery had somehow attracted official attention despite their attempts to investigate quietly before involving authorities. "The kind that involves federal agencies asking questions about historical events that supposedly never happened," Sheriff Martinez replied cryptically. "Agent Sarah Chun from the FBI's art crime team called this morning. Apparently someone has been monitoring online searches related to World War II aircraft and precious stone smuggling operations." Marcus felt his stomach drop at the mention of federal surveillance, remembering military operations where digital intelligence had revealed enemy activities through seemingly innocent research patterns. Someone had been watching for exactly the kind of historical investigation that Tyler's systematic approach had inevitably triggered through database searches and archive consultations. "What kind of monitoring?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on his experience with military intelligence operations that tracked potential threats through their information-gathering activities. "The kind that suggests your aircraft discovery isn't the first time someone has searched for missing diamonds that were supposedly lost during classified military operations in 1943, Sheriff Martinez said bluntly. "Agent Chun wants to meet with you today about treasure hunting activities that might interfere with ongoing federal investigations." Marcus looked at Tyler, who had stopped arranging his sketches to listen to the conversation with focused attention. That suggested he understood the implications better than most teenagers would have. Their quiet family research project had somehow triggered federal attention that could either validate their discovery or complicate their lives in ways that small-town farming families weren't equipped to handle. "How much time do we have?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer since federal investigations operated according to coding too. Schedules that didn't accommodate family convenience or financial desperation. "She's driving down from Nashville right now," Sheriff Martinez replied. "Should be here within 2 hours." "Marcus, I know you've got principles about dealing with federal agencies, but this could be the opportunity your family has been needing if you handle it correctly." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he calculated what federal cooperation might mean for their family's financial stability, the legal complications of claiming discovered treasure, and the historical significance of evidence that could reshape understanding of World War II operations. But he also understood the risks involved in dealing with agencies whose priorities might not align with rural family interests. "We'll be ready," Marcus said finally, knowing that he'd already made his decision regardless of the personal costs or professional risks involved. Tyler's future depended on opportunities like this, and their family's survival required taking calculated risks, rather than accepting gradual defeat through financial attrition. After ending the call, Marcus found Tyler watching him with the kind of serious expression that made him look older than his 17 years, his analytical mind already processing the federal implications of their historical discovery with systematic thinking that impressed and worried his father in equal measure. Are we going to cooperate with the FBI investigation? Tyler asked, his voice carrying both excitement and concern about involving federal authorities in family matters that had already become more complicated than routine farm improvement projects. Maybe, Marcus replied, unwilling to commit to something that could end in public failure or legal complications that could destroy their remaining financial stability. What do you think we should do? Tyler considered the question with careful deliberation that had impressed his teachers, while highlighting his unusual maturity, approaching problems with analytical frameworks that most adults never developed. At 17, he already understood that historical discoveries involved political and economic factors that extended far beyond simple archaeological or treasure hunting considerations. I think we should document everything we found before federal agents arrive, Tyler said. Finally, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had characterized all his academic achievements. Not to hide evidence, but to ensure we understand the complete story before someone else controls the narrative about what happened here. Marcus smiled at his son's wisdom, remembering similar advice from military historians about approaching complex situations with curiosity rather than assumptions, understanding that federal investigations sometimes overlooked details that didn't support predetermined conclusions about historical events. That's excellent thinking, Tyler, Marcus said, reaching across to ruffle his son's hair with affection that encompassed pride, concern, and determination to protect opportunities that could transform their family circumstances. Want to help me document the most significant historical discovery in Tennessee history? Absolutely, Tyler replied, his face lighting up with excitement that made all of Marcus's worries about federal complications seem manageable. You'd be honored to have my help with investigating a real historical mystery? I'd be honored to work with the smartest research partner in Riverside County, Marcus replied, meaning every word while understanding that Tyler's insights had often illuminated aspects of complex problems that his military training had overlooked as they prepared to complete their documentation before federal agents arrived. Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the day ahead. Their aircraft discovery represented either the opportunity that could secure Tyler's education and their family's farm, or the complication that could destroy their remaining stability through legal battles they couldn't afford to fight outside their kitchen window. The Hartwell farm stretched toward distant mountains that had witnessed generations of family struggle and achievement. The land that had supported 4 generations of agricultural life now threatened by economic forces that made small-scale farming increasingly impossible. But hidden beneath their pond lay evidence of historical events that could either vindicate their family's perseverance or expose them to dangers they weren't equipped to handle. Tomorrow would bring federal agents whose investigation could transform their lives in ways they couldn't predict or control. But tonight belonged to a father and son united by curiosity, determination, and shared belief that understanding was more powerful than institutional authority. The aircraft waiting beneath their pond water might hold secrets that had been classified for 70 years. But Marcus suspected that the real test wouldn't be historical knowledge or treasure hunting expertise. It would be the willingness to see truth where others saw only complications, to find justice where others found only jurisdictional disputes, and to trust that sometimes the most profound discoveries emerged from family farms where ordinary people refused to accept that extraordinary answers were beyond their reach. The federal investigation was approaching, and Marcus Hartwell was ready to prove that military veterans and their exceptional children could succeed where professional investigators had failed for 7 decades. Agent Sarah Chun's black sedan navigated the gravel road leading to the Hartwell farm with the purposeful precision of someone who'd spent years investigating cases where historical mysteries intersected with federal crimes. The vehicle's government plates and tinted windows seemed almost insulting against the backdrop of weathered barns and struggling crops that told the story of rural America's economic decline. a family farm that had survived 4 generations of agricultural challenges but now faced foreclosure due to circumstances beyond any farmer's control. Marcus stood in the farmhouse doorway, watching the sedan approach while calculating the implications of federal involvement in what had started as a simple pond drainage project. His military experience had taught him that government investigations operated according to priorities that didn't always align with civilian interests, especially when those investigations involved classified historical events and valuable discoveries that could reshape official narratives about wartime operations. Agent Chun emerged from her vehicle with the controlled professionalism of someone accustomed to extracting truth from situations where multiple parties had reasons to conceal information. At 42, she carried herself with the confident authority that came from successfully resolving art theft cases worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But her expression suggested genuine curiosity about discoveries that had triggered federal attention through sophisticated monitoring systems. "Mr. Hartwell, thank you for agreeing to meet with me on such short notice," Agent Chun said, her voice carrying respectful acknowledgement of his military service while maintaining the investigative distance that prevented personal relationships from compromising professional objectivity. "I understand you've made a discovery that relates to historical events my department has been investigating for several years." "Agent Chun, this is my son Tyler," Marcus replied, gesturing toward Tyler, who stood beside him with notebook in hand, prepared to document whatever federal complications their aircraft discovery had created. "He's been instrumental in researching the historical context of what we found in our pond." Agent Chun's attention shifted to Tyler, with the kind of surprised interest that adults often showed teenagers who demonstrated unexpected expertise in complex subjects. Her FBI training had taught her to evaluate information sources based on credibility rather than age. But 17-year-old historical researchers were unusual enough to warrant careful assessment. "Tyler, I've reviewed some of the database searches that triggered our monitoring systems," Agent Chun said, settling into the kitchen chair that Marcus offered while spreading official documents across the table that had hosted 3 generations of family decisions. "Your research methodology is remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal training in historical investigation." Tyler felt a surge of pride at the federal recognition of his analytical abilities, though he remained cautious about sharing information that could complicate his family's financial situation if federal agencies decided to claim jurisdiction over their discovery. His systematic approach to historical research had been developed through years of helping his father navigate Veterans Administration bureaucracy, learning to find truth in institutional systems that often obscured rather than revealed important information. "I've been studying World War II logistics and cargo operations because the aircraft in our pond doesn't match any documented military activities in this region. During 1943, Tyler explained, his voice carrying the confidence that had impressed his teachers while highlighting analytical skills that exceeded typical high school capabilities. The flight path, cargo manifest, and operational timeline all suggest classified operations that weren't recorded in official military archives." Agent Chun leaned forward with obvious interest, understanding that Tyler's independent research had identified inconsistencies that professional investigators had been pursuing through different channels for years without achieving definitive conclusions. The FBI's art crime team had been tracking stolen diamonds and precious stones that had disappeared during wartime operations, but their investigations had been hampered by classified documents and institutional resistance to acknowledging controversial historical events. "What specific inconsistencies have you identified?" Agent Chun asked, producing a tablet that displayed federal case files related to wartime theft and smuggling operations that had never been publicly acknowledged or fully investigated due to national security considerations. Tyler opened his notebook to pages filled with detailed analysis of military records, geographical surveys, and historical timelines that painted a comprehensive picture of events that official documentation had either ignored or deliberately obscured. His research demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking that federal investigators admired, while highlighting gaps in official narratives that suggested deliberate concealment of important information. The C-47 transport aircraft in our pond was supposedly assigned to routine supply missions between established military bases. Tyler began his presentation organized with academic precision that impressed Agent Chun despite her experience with professional historical consultants. But the flight path that would have brought it over our farm doesn't connect any documented military installations, and the cargo manifest lists supplies that don't match the aircraft's actual contents. Marcus watched his son present evidence that could either secure their family's future or expose them to federal complications they weren't equipped to handle. Feeling proud of Tyler's analytical abilities, while remaining concerned about agencies whose investigations might prioritize institutional interests over family welfare. The Veterans Administration had taught him that federal cooperation could produce either beneficial outcomes or bureaucratic nightmares, depending on factors that civilian families couldn't predict or control. "You're describing Operation Sterling," Agent Chun said slowly, her admission carrying implications that suggested Tyler's independent research had identified classified activities that federal agencies had been investigating through official channels for decades without achieving public resolution. A series of covert operations that involved transporting valuable assets through unofficial channels to prevent them from falling into enemy hands during potential military reversals. The revelation hung in the farmhouse kitchen like an explosive device with an uncertain timer, transforming their family discovery into evidence of wartime operations that had been classified for 70 years due to political and economic sensitivities that extended far beyond simple military security. Marcus felt his military training engage as he recognized the signs of institutional secrecy that protected powerful interests rather than national security. "What kind of valuable assets?" Marcus asked, though his experience with classified operations suggested he already understood the answer based on the diamonds they discovered scattered across their pond bottom, like impossible treasure waiting for the right family to claim it. Diamonds, precious stones, and other portable wealth that European resistance movements were trying to smuggle out of Nazi-occupied territories. Agent Chun explained, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone whose career depended on maintaining classified information while providing enough context to secure civilian cooperation. The operations were never officially acknowledged because they involved partnerships with groups whose political affiliations became problematic during post-war restructuring. Tyler's notebook filled with details as Agent Chun outlined historical events that connected their rural Tennessee discovery to international conspiracies involving resistance movements, military intelligence, and the kind of wartime improvisation that created opportunities for both heroism and criminal exploitation. The aircraft in their pond represented more than crashed military equipment. It was evidence of operations that had shaped European recovery while enriching individuals whose cooperation had been purchased through arrangements that couldn't survive post-war scrutiny. "So the diamonds in our pond are stolen Nazi treasure?" Tyler asked with characteristic directness that cut through federal euphemisms and diplomatic language to reach the fundamental questions that determined whether their family's discovery represented legitimate treasure or evidence of wartime crimes. "That's what we're trying to determine," Agent Chun replied honestly, her investigation complicated by decades of classification and institutional resistance to acknowledging operations that had involved morally ambiguous partnerships with groups whose wartime cooperation had been necessary but politically embarrassing. The legal status of assets recovered from Operation Sterling depends on documentation that was either destroyed or remains classified at levels that prevent complete historical analysis. Marcus understood the implications better than Tyler. recognizing federal language that meant their discovery existed in legal limbo, where property rights would be determined by agencies whose priorities extended beyond simple ownership questions to include international relations and institutional reputation management. The Hartwell family farm had become the center of disputes that involved multiple governments and decades of diplomatic complexity. What does this mean for our family's claim to what we discovered on our own property? Marcus asked directly, his military experience teaching him that federal agencies preferred clear questions that allowed for precise answers rather than diplomatic evasion that concealed important information behind bureaucratic language. Agent Chun studied Marcus and Tyler with expressions that suggested genuine respect for their situation, while acknowledging federal responsibilities that might conflict with family interests, depending on how the investigation developed. Her years of resolving art theft cases had taught her that the most complex situations involved multiple legitimate claims to valuable assets, requiring solutions that balanced legal requirements with practical justice. That depends on several factors that we're still investigating, Agent Chun said carefully. If the diamonds were legitimately acquired through official military operations, your discovery rights would be protected under salvage laws and property regulations. If they represent stolen assets that belong to individuals or institutions whose claims predate the military operations, the legal situation becomes significantly more complicated. Tyler looked up from his notebook where he'd been documenting federal explanations that revealed as much through their limitations as through their content, understanding that Agent Chun was describing investigations that could either validate their family's discovery or expose them to legal battles that could destroy their remaining financial stability through attorney fees and federal procedures. How long do these investigations typically take? Tyler asked, his question carrying implications about college deadlines and mortgage payments that couldn't be postponed while federal agencies resolved historical mysteries that had been pending for 70 years without definitive conclusions. Months or years, depending on the complexity of international coordination required and the availability of classified documents that might clarify ownership questions. Agent Chun admitted, her honesty about federal timelines revealing the reality that family financial needs would not accelerate institutional processes that operated according to bureaucratic schedules rather than civilian emergency situations. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he considered the implications of extended federal involvement in their family's survival, the college opportunities that Tyler couldn't defer indefinitely, and the farm mortgage that wouldn't wait for historical investigations to resolve questions that should have been answered decades earlier. The Veterans Administration had taught him that federal agencies often promised eventual resolution while providing inadequate, immediate assistance to families whose circumstances required prompt action. Agent Chun, I appreciate your honesty about the timeline and complexity, Marcus said, his military directness cutting through diplomatic language to address practical concerns that determined whether federal cooperation would help or harm his family's immediate situation. But we need to understand whether this investigation will prevent us from addressing financial emergencies that can't wait for historical resolution. Agent Chun's expression suggested genuine sympathy for their situation, while acknowledging federal limitations that prevented agencies from providing financial assistance to families whose discoveries had created investigative opportunities, but not immediate economic relief. Her years of working with civilian treasure hunters had taught her that the most significant discoveries often involved families whose circumstances made extended legal battles financially impossible. I understand your position, and I want to help your family navigate this situation in ways that protect both your interests and federal investigation requirements, Agent Chun said, her tone carrying professional respect for military veterans, while acknowledging practical constraints that limited federal flexibility in cases involving classified historical events. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Marcus realized that their aircraft discovery had transformed their family struggle from simple financial desperation into complex federal involvement that could either secure Tyler's future or destroy their remaining stability through legal complications they couldn't afford to fight. The diamonds beneath their pond water represented either salvation or destruction, depending on factors that small-town farming families couldn't predict or control. But looking at Tyler's determined expression as he documented federal explanations, and Agent Chun's respectful acknowledgement of their discovery's significance, Marcus understood that some opportunities required accepting risks that seemed manageable compared to the certainty of failure through inaction. Their pond had revealed more than historical artifacts or valuable gems. It had exposed connections between their family's survival and events that had shaped international history in ways that official records had never acknowledged. Tyler crouched beside the pond's remaining water, his military surplus metal detector sweeping methodically across the submerged aircraft while Agent Chun observed from the bank with the focused attention of someone whose career had been built on recognizing patterns that others missed. The afternoon sun penetrated the murky water just enough to illuminate sections of the Ki-47's fuselage, revealing details that transformed Tyler's historical research from theoretical investigation into hands-on archaeological discovery. "Cargo bay door is partially open," Tyler announced, his voice carrying controlled excitement as he documented observations that could reshape understanding of Operation Sterling's true scope and purpose. "I can see additional containers that weren't visible from the surface, and there's something attached to the aircraft's exterior that doesn't match standard military configurations." Agent Chun moved closer to the water's edge, her FBI training engaging as she recognized the significance of Tyler's systematic approach to evidence documentation. Professional treasure hunters often damaged historical sites through aggressive excavation techniques, but Tyler's methodical investigation preserved contextual information that could prove crucial for determining the legal status of whatever they discovered. "What kind of attachment?" Agent Chun asked, understanding that military aircraft modifications often indicated specialized missions that weren't recorded in official documentation, especially when those missions involved partnerships with resistance. Movements whose activities remained classified for diplomatic reasons. Tyler adjusted his position to get a better view of the aircraft's exterior modifications, his notebook filling with sketches that captured details which photographs might miss due to water distortion and limited visibility. His systematic documentation had impressed Agent Chun, whose experience with civilian investigators had taught her to appreciate methodical approaches that preserved evidence rather than simply extracting valuable items. "It looks like external cargo pods that were added after the aircraft left the factory," Tyler explained, his analysis drawing on months of studying World War II aviation technology and modification techniques used for specialized operations. "The mounting points show welding patterns that suggest field modifications, probably done at forward bases where standard supply missions were adapted for covert cargo transport." Marcus joined them at the pond's edge, his military experience allowing him to interpret Tyler's observations within the context of wartime logistics and operational security requirements that had forced military personnel to improvise solutions for missions that official doctrine hadn't anticipated. The external modification suggested planning and preparation that went beyond simple transportation accidents or navigation errors. "Field modifications indicate deliberate mission planning," Marcus observed, his intelligence background helping him understand the implications of aircraft changes that represented institutional commitment to operations that required specialized equipment and extended preparation time. Someone invested significant resources in preparing this aircraft for missions that weren't supposed to exist according to official records. Agent Chun produced a waterproof tablet that displayed federal case files related to Operation Sterling, her decision to share classified information, representing unusual trust in civilian investigators whose discovery had provided more concrete evidence than federal agencies had obtained through years of official investigation. The files contained fragmentary reports from intelligence officers whose accounts had been classified or dismissed due to lack of corroborating physical evidence. According to partially declassified documents, Operation Sterling involved multiple aircraft that were modified for carrying high-value cargo through routes that bypassed normal military logistics networks. Agent Chun explained, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone whose career depended on protecting classified information while providing enough context to secure civilian cooperation. The operations were designed to prevent valuable assets from falling into enemy hands if military positions became untenable. Tyler studied the federal documents with growing understanding of how their family discovery connected to international events that had shaped post-war reconstruction while remaining hidden from public acknowledgement due to political sensitivities that extended far beyond simple military security considerations. The aircraft in their pond represented evidence of operations that had influenced European recovery through methods that couldn't survive diplomatic scrutiny. But why Tennessee? Tyler asked, his analytical mind focusing on geographical inconsistencies that suggested their discovery involved more than simple transportation accidents or mechanical failures. If Operation Sterling was evacuating assets from European theaters, what brought this aircraft to a rural farming region that had no strategic military significance? The question hung in the humid Tennessee air like a challenge to official narratives that had shaped federal investigations for decades, without producing satisfactory explanations for evidence that contradicted institutional assumptions about wartime operations and post-war asset recovery. Agent Chun's expression suggested that Tyler had identified the central mystery that had frustrated professional investigators, whose resources far exceeded those available to rural families. That's what we've been trying to determine for 15 years, Agent Chun admitted, her honesty about federal limitations revealing the reality that institutional resources hadn't been sufficient to resolve questions that as 17-year-olds systematic research had highlighted through independent investigation. Every lead we followed has ended in classified documents or destroyed records that prevent complete reconstruction of what actually happened. Marcus felt the familiar recognition of institutional patterns that prioritize protecting classified operations over resolving historical questions. Understanding that federal agencies often found themselves constrained by bureaucratic requirements that prevented them from acknowledging information that could embarrass powerful interests or reveal uncomfortable truths about wartime partnerships. What if the aircraft wasn't supposed to be here? Marcus suggested, his military experience providing perspective on operations where mission parameters changed due to circumstances that commanders couldn't anticipate or control. Emergency landings, mechanical failures, or crew decisions that deviated from original flight plans could explain geographical inconsistencies. Tyler's attention had been drawn to something else visible through the pond water, a detail that transformed speculative discussion into immediate investigative priority. His metal detector had identified metallic signatures that appeared separate from the aircraft itself, suggesting additional evidence that could provide answers to questions that had frustrated federal investigators for decades. "There's something else down there," Tyler announced, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone whose systematic investigation had revealed evidence that official searches had overlooked. Metallic objects that appear to be separate from the aircraft, positioned in ways that suggest they were either ejected during the crash or placed there deliberately. Agent Chun moved to Tyler's position, her federal training focusing on evidence that could provide breakthrough information for investigations that had been stalled by lack of physical proof. Professional archaeological techniques would normally be required for underwater recovery operations, but the Hartwell family's discovery had created opportunities that might not survive extended bureaucratic procedures. Can you determine what kind of objects without disturbing the site? Agent Chun asked, understanding that evidence preservation requirements might conflict with investigative urgency if other interested parties learned about the discovery and attempted to claim the materials before federal jurisdiction could be established. Tyler consulted his metal detector readings while sketching approximate positions and sizes of the objects his equipment had identified, his documentation creating permanent records that could support legal claims regardless of what subsequent investigation revealed. His methodical approach had impressed Agent Chen, whose experience with treasure hunting cases had taught her to appreciate systematic investigation over aggressive excavation. Based on size and metallic composition, they appear to be additional cargo containers that were either secured outside the aircraft or ejected before impact. Tyler reported, his analysis combining technical detection data with historical knowledge of military cargo transport procedures used during emergency situations. The positioning suggests deliberate placement rather than random scattering from crash damage. Marcus understood the implications immediately, recognizing patterns that suggested crew survival and post-crash activity rather than simple transportation accidents that left no survivors to manage cargo or equipment. Military personnel were trained to secure valuable materials even during emergency situations, prioritizing mission completion over personal safety when circumstances demanded ultimate dedication to operational objectives. If crew members survived the crash, they might have attempted to conceal or protect the cargo before seeking rescue. Marcus explained, his military background providing context for decisions that civilian investigators might not understand. Standard operating procedures required personnel to prevent valuable materials from falling into unauthorized hands, even at personal cost. Agent Chun's tablet displayed federal files that contained crew rosters for Operation Sterling aircraft, her access to classified personnel records representing unusual trust in civilian investigators, whose discovery had provided more concrete leads than federal agencies had developed through official channels. The crew information revealed details that connected their pond discovery to individual stories of heroism and sacrifice that had been classified for diplomatic reasons. The crew of aircraft designation OS-47 Delta included Captain James Morrison, Lieutenant Sarah Walsh, Sergeant Miguel Santos, and Corporal David Chun. Agent Chun read from federal records, her voice carrying respectful acknowledgement of military personnel whose service had been classified due to the sensitive nature of their final mission. All 4 were reported missing in action with no recovery of remains or equipment. Tyler looked up from his documentation with growing understanding of how their family discovery represented more than valuable treasure or historical artifacts. It was evidence of military personnel whose sacrifice had been obscured by classification requirements that prevented their families from understanding what had happened during their final service to their country. Agent Chun, is David Chun related to you? Tyler asked with characteristic directness that cut through bureaucratic protocol to address personal connections that explained federal interest in investigations that might otherwise have been delegated to local authorities. Corporal David Chun was my grandfather, Agent Chun replied quietly, her professional composure revealing the personal motivation that had driven her 15-year investigation into Operation Sterling and the fate of crew members whose families had never received complete information about their final missions. My family has been searching for answers about what happened to him since 1943. The revelation transformed their investigative dynamic from federal oversight of civilian discovery into shared commitment to resolving historical mysteries that had affected multiple families for generations, creating opportunities for cooperation that transcended typical boundaries between government agencies and private citizens. Marcus felt immediate recognition of the family sacrifice that military service often demanded, understanding Agent Chun's dedication to uncovering truth that institutional classification had concealed. Then we're investigating more than treasure or historical artifacts, Marcus said, his military background providing perspective on the personal stakes that made Agent Chun's investigation more than professional obligation. We're searching for closure that military families deserve, regardless of classification requirements or diplomatic sensitivities. Agent Chun nodded with obvious appreciation for Marcus's understanding of military family dynamics, her FBI training, complemented by personal experience with the emotional costs of incomplete information about loved ones whose service had been classified for reasons that family members couldn't fully understand or evaluate. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Tyler's systematic investigation had revealed evidence that transformed their pond discovery from simple treasure hunting into complex archaeological and personal investigation that could provide answers to questions that had frustrated professional investigators for decades. The aircraft beneath their pond water contained more than valuable cargo. It held the key to understanding individual sacrifice and institutional secrecy that had shaped post-war history in ways that official records had never acknowledged. But recovering that evidence would require techniques and resources that exceeded what rural families could provide independently, creating opportunities for federal cooperation that could either secure their discovery or expose them to bureaucratic complications that might prevent successful resolution of mysteries that deserved answers regardless of their legal or diplomatic complexity. Looking at Agent Chun's determined expression and Tyler's methodical documentation, Marcus realized that their family's financial survival had become connected to much larger questions about military honor, historical truth, and the responsibility of government agencies to provide closure for families whose sacrifice had been classified for reasons that might no longer justify continued secrecy. The discovery that transformed their investigation from treasure hunting to family closure came at dawn the next morning, when Tyler's methodical grid search of the pond bottom revealed evidence that federal agencies had been seeking for 7 decades without success. Using underwater metal detection equipment borrowed from the County Archaeological Society, Tyler had identified metallic signatures that appeared to be personal effects rather than military cargo, items that could provide definitive identification of crew members whose families had never received closure about their final mission. "Dad, Agent Chun, you need to see this immediately," Tyler called from his position at the pond's edge, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone whose systematic investigation had uncovered evidence that could reshape official understanding of Operation Sterling's true scope and tragic conclusion. "I found what appears to be personal identification materials that were preserved in waterproof containers." Marcus and Agent Chun approached the water's edge where Tyler had positioned marker flags indicating the locations of objects his equipment had identified during hours of careful searching that had begun before sunrise. His dedication to thorough investigation had impressed Agent Chun, whose experience with civilian treasure hunters had taught her that most people lacked the patience required for proper archaeological documentation. Military personnel were required to carry identification in waterproof cases during covert operations, Agent Chun explained, her voice tight with emotion as she realized that Tyler's discovery might finally provide the closure her family had sought for 8 decades. If those containers survived submersion, they could contain information that was never transmitted through official channels due to the classified nature of the mission. Tyler consulted his detection equipment readings while sketching precise locations of metallic signatures that suggested multiple personal effects containers distributed across the aircraft's immediate vicinity, their positioning indicating that crew members had survived the initial crash and attempted to secure identification materials before whatever circumstances had prevented their survival or rescue. The containers appear to be located outside the aircraft's main structure, Tyler reported, his analysis combining technical data with understanding of military emergency procedures that prioritized mission security even during life-threatening situations. Their placement suggests deliberate positioning rather than random distribution from crash impact, which means crew members were conscious and mobile after the aircraft went down. Marcus felt his military training engage as he recognized patterns that suggested post-crash survival and decision-making by personnel, whose final actions had demonstrated dedication to operational security, even when personal survival became impossible. The positioning of personal effects indicated systematic thinking and military discipline that had continued functioning despite emergency circumstances that had ultimately proved fatal. If crew members survived long enough to secure identification materials, they might have also protected or concealed other evidence that could explain what brought them to Tennessee instead of their designated destination, Marcus observed. His intelligence background providing perspective on decisions that military personnel made when standard procedures became inadequate for extraordinary circumstances. Agent Chun produced specialized underwater recovery equipment from her vehicle. Her FBI resources including tools that were typically reserved for major federal investigations but which she was authorized to deploy for evidence that could resolve decades of classified mystery. Her personal investment in discovering the truth about her grandfather's fate had motivated her to secure unusual resources for civilian cooperation that normally wouldn't have been available. We need to recover these containers carefully to preserve any documentation they might contain, Agent Chun said, her voice carrying the professional precision of someone whose career had been built on extracting maximum information from limited evidence. Military identification materials were designed to survive extreme conditions, but 70 years of submersion may have damaged paper documents, even in waterproof cases. Tyler assisted with the recovery operation, his systematic approach to evidence handling complementing Agent Chun's professional techniques while ensuring that their family's discovery rights were preserved through proper documentation of every step in the investigation process. His notebook filled with detailed sketches and measurements that created permanent records of evidence, positioning and recovery procedures. The first waterproof container they recovered bore the distinctive markings of World War II military issue. Its metal construction showing corrosion from decades of submersion but maintaining structural integrity that suggested possible preservation of internal contents. Agent Chun's hands trembled slightly as she prepared to open a container that might contain information about her grandfather's final mission and the circumstances that had brought him to a Tennessee farm pond instead of his designated destination. Container designation MP7745, recovered from grid position Delta 3. Tyler documented with academic precision that impressed Agent Chun while creating legal records that could support their family's claim to any discoveries made through their systematic investigation. External condition shows corrosion consistent with extended submersion, but internal seal appears intact. Agent Chun opened the container with surgical care, revealing documentation that had been preserved in remarkable condition due to military-grade waterproofing technology that had protected paper materials from decay that would normally have destroyed such evidence within years of submersion. The contents included personal identification, mission orders, and handwritten notes that provided the first direct evidence of Operation Sterling's true purpose and tragic conclusion. Personal identification for Corporal David Chun, service number 32,847,519. Agent Chun read aloud, her voice breaking slightly as she held tangible proof of her grandfather's presence at the site, where her family had wondered about his fate for 8 decades. Mission orders dated March 15, 1943, authorizing transport of high-value assets to coordinates that don't match any documented military installations. Marcus studied the mission orders with growing understanding of operations that had required improvisation and adaptation when original plans proved inadequate for circumstances that military commanders couldn't have anticipated. The coordinates specified in the documentation indicated destinations that were either classified beyond normal military security levels or represented locations that had been established for purposes that official records had never acknowledged. The destination coordinates correspond to a location approximately 40 miles from here, Tyler observed after consulting geographical surveys on his tablet, his analytical skills allowing him to translate military grid references into civilian mapping systems that revealed the broader scope of Operation Sterling's intended activities. But that area was privately owned farmland in 1943, with no documented military facilities or strategic significance. Agent Chun compared the coordinates to federal case files that contained fragmentary information about Operation Sterling's network of safe houses and temporary storage facilities, her investigation revealing that the mission had involved multiple civilian locations that had been established for asset protection during emergency scenarios that military planners hoped would never become necessary. Operation Sterling included contingency plans for civilian asset storage if military facilities became compromised. Agent Chun explained, her access to classified files providing context that helped explain why military aircraft had been operating in regions that seemed to have no connection to official military activities. The coordinates in your grandfather's mission orders indicate one of those civilian facilities. Tyler's systematic investigation had revealed evidence that federal agencies had been seeking for decades without success, but the personal identification materials were only the beginning of discoveries that would reshape understanding of wartime operations and individual sacrifice. Additional containers held documentation that provided insight into the crew's final hours and the circumstances that had brought them to the Hartwell family pond instead of their intended destination. There's a handwritten log entry dated March 18, 1943. Agent Chun continued reading from documents that provided the first eyewitness account of events that had frustrated federal investigators for 70 years. Aircraft experiencing mechanical difficulties, crew attempting emergency landing, cargo secure but mission compromised, weather conditions preventing extraction to alternate coordinates. Marcus recognized the language of military personnel maintaining operational discipline, even during emergency situations that had made mission completion impossible, understanding that the crew had continued following protocols designed to protect valuable assets even when their own survival had become uncertain. The log indicates they were attempting to reach the civilian storage facility when mechanical problems forced an emergency landing. Marcus translated military terminology for Tyler, whose historical research had provided excellent context but whose civilian background required explanation of military decision-making under extreme pressure. They prioritized cargo security over personal safety, which is exactly what military training would have required. Tyler documented each piece of evidence with methodical precision while processing the human implications of documentation that revealed individual courage and sacrifice during circumstances that had tested military personnel beyond normal operational parameters. The crew members whose personal effects they were recovering had faced impossible choices between duty and survival, ultimately choosing service over self-preservation. Agent Chun, there's additional documentation here that appears to be encrypted or coded, Tyler observed, studying handwritten materials that used abbreviations and references that didn't match standard military terminology from the period. The entries suggest they were carrying more than diamonds or precious stones, and that other parties were aware of their cargo and intended destination. Agent Chun examined the coded documentation with growing concern, recognizing patterns that suggested Operation Sterling had been compromised by intelligence, leaks or surveillance that had exposed classified missions to hostile observation. The crew's emergency landing might not have been due to mechanical failure alone, but rather to circumstances that had made their original destination unsafe for reasons that official military channels had never acknowledged. If the mission was compromised, it could explain why they diverted to this location instead of proceeding to their designated coordinates. Agent Chun said, her investigation taking on new urgency as she realized that Tyler's family discovery might provide evidence of wartime intelligence failures or deliberate sabotage that had cost military lives while protecting valuable assets. Someone may have been tracking Operation Sterling aircraft and attempting to intercept their cargo. The implications sent visible shockwaves through the investigation team as they processed evidence that suggested their pond discovery involved more than transportation accidents or mechanical failures. The crew of OS-47 Delta had been operating in hostile territory, where their mission security had been compromised by forces that had been tracking valuable cargo for purposes that extended beyond simple military opposition. Marcus felt his protective instincts engage as he realized that Tyler's systematic investigation had uncovered evidence of historical events that might still involve dangerous individuals or organizations whose interest in Operation Sterling assets hadn't ended with the war's conclusion. If someone had been tracking diamond shipments in 1943, those same interests might be monitoring current discovery efforts through sophisticated surveillance that federal agencies couldn't completely prevent. Agent Chun, do we need to consider current security implications if our investigation has attracted attention from parties whose interest in Operation Sterling extends beyond historical curiosity? Marcus asked, his military experience providing perspective on threats that civilian investigators might not recognize until dangerous situations had already developed. Agent Chun's expression confirmed Marcus's concerns, while revealing federal limitations that prevented complete protection for civilian families whose discoveries had exposed them to risks that exceeded typical treasure hunting complications. Her years of investigating art theft cases had taught her that valuable discoveries often attracted attention from criminal organizations whose resources and determination could threaten anyone who interfered with their objectives. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Hartwell farm, their investigation had revealed evidence that transformed simple family discovery into complex federal case involving historical mysteries, personal closure, and potential ongoing security threats that could affect their lives in ways they were just beginning to understand. The aircraft beneath their pond contained more than treasure or military artifacts. It held secrets that powerful forces had spent decades trying to conceal or control. Breakthrough that revealed the true scope of Operation Sterling's continuing danger came when Tyler's systematic documentation triggered sophisticated surveillance systems that had been monitoring online databases for exactly the kind of historical research his investigation had required. At 3 a.m, motion sensors around the Hartwell farm detected vehicles approaching through routes that bypassed main roads, their occupants using night vision equipment and military-grade communication devices that suggested professional, rather than opportunistic interest in the family's discovery. Marcus jolted awake to the harsh beeping of perimeter alarms he'd installed after returning from Afghanistan, his combat training immediately engaging as he recognized patterns that indicated coordinated surveillance rather than random trespassing. Through his bedroom window, he could see infrared signatures that revealed at least 4 individuals positioned around the farmhouse with equipment that exceeded typical civilian capabilities, their movements demonstrating tactical discipline that suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. "Tyler, wake up quietly and stay away from windows," Marcus whispered, his voice carrying the controlled urgency that had kept his unit alive during night operations in hostile territory. "We have visitors who aren't here for social conversation, and their equipment suggests they're professionals rather than treasure hunters." Tyler emerged from his room with notebook in hand, his systematic approach to documentation extending even to emergency situations that required immediate response rather than careful analysis. His civilian background hadn't prepared him for security threats, but his analytical mind quickly processed the implications of professional surveillance, targeting their family's aircraft discovery. "Are they federal agents?" Tyler asked quietly, understanding that their cooperation with Agent Chun might have triggered additional government interest and evidence that could resolve classified historical mysteries while creating new complications. For rural families whose discovery had exceeded their ability to manage complex bureaucratic situations. Not unless federal agents started using unmarked vehicles and avoiding official communication protocols, Marcus replied, his military experience allowing him to distinguish between legitimate law enforcement procedures and surveillance techniques. That suggested other motivations for interest in Operation Sterling materials. These people are operating according to protocols that indicate private rather than government authorization. Marcus activated encrypted communication equipment he'd maintained since his military discharge. His Veterans Administration disability, including provisions for security systems that acknowledged ongoing threats to personnel whose service had involved intelligence operations that continued creating risks years after official deployment ended. The equipment allowed secure contact with law enforcement and federal agencies when standard communication channels might be compromised. Agent Chun, this is Marcus Hartwell, he transmitted through channels that bypassed normal telephone networks, while providing automatic encryption that protected sensitive communications from interception by surveillance equipment that hostile parties might have deployed around their property. We have unauthorized personnel conducting professional surveillance of our property using equipment that suggests significant resources and training. Agent Chun's response came immediately, indicating that federal agencies had been anticipating exactly this kind of development since Tyler's research had triggered monitoring systems that tracked interest in Operation Sterling materials. Her voice carried the controlled tension of someone whose investigation had revealed threats that extended beyond historical curiosity to include ongoing criminal activity that had been waiting decades for opportunities like the Hartwell family's discovery. Marcus, we've been tracking communication intercepts that suggest multiple parties have been monitoring database searches related to World War II diamond trafficking. Agent Chun transmitted, her federal resources providing intelligence that civilian families couldn't access independently. Your son's research methodology triggered attention from organizations whose interest in Operation Sterling extends far beyond academic investigation. Tyler listened to federal communications that revealed the broader implications of his systematic historical research, understanding that his analytical approach to documenting aircraft evidence had inadvertently exposed their family to dangers that professional investigators had been trying to avoid through classified procedures and controlled information sharing. His documentation had been thorough enough to attract exactly the wrong kind of attention from exactly the wrong kind of people. What kind of organizations? Marcus asked, though his military experience suggested he already understood the answer. Based on surveillance techniques that indicated resources and coordination capabilities that exceeded typical criminal operations, while falling short of official government authorization. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. International networks that have been tracking Operation Sterling assets since 1943. Agent Chun replied, her investigation revealing connections between wartime criminal activity and modern organizations whose illegal operations had been funded by Nazi treasure that had never been recovered through official channels. The diamonds in your pond aren't just historical artifacts. They're assets that criminal organizations have been seeking for 70 years. Marcus felt his protective instincts fully engage as he realized that Tyler's discovery had exposed their family to threats that connected their rural Tennessee farm to international criminal networks, whose resources and determination could destroy anyone who interfered with operations that had been generating illegal profits for decades. The aircraft beneath their pond represented more than treasure or historical evidence. It was the key to criminal enterprises that powerful people would kill to protect. How immediate is the threat level? Marcus asked, his military training focusing on tactical assessment while his parental responsibilities demanded understanding of risks that could affect Tyler's safety and their family's survival through circumstances that exceeded typical civilian emergency preparedness. Immediate enough that I'm coordinating emergency response through federal channels that include tactical support, Agent Chun replied, her FBI authority allowing access to resources that could provide protection for civilian families, whose discoveries had created national security implications. But we need you to secure the evidence and prepare for extraction procedures that might become necessary if hostile parties attempt forced access to Operation Sterling materials. Tyler had been monitoring the surveillance through military equipment that provided thermal imaging of personnel positions around their property. His systematic approach to threat assessment helping identify weaknesses in hostile deployment that could be exploited if emergency escape became necessary. His analytical skills were adapting to security situations with remarkable speed, suggesting intellectual flexibility that impressed his father while highlighting abilities that could prove crucial for their survival. The surveillance team has positioned themselves to monitor all normal exit routes, but they haven't accounted for the drainage channels that connect our property to neighboring farms, Tyler observed, his knowledge of local geography providing tactical advantages that professional surveillance might have overlooked during initial reconnaissance operations. If we need to evacuate, there are routes that would allow movement without detection by their current positions. Marcus felt pride surge through his concern as he recognized Tyler's natural aptitude for tactical thinking, understanding that his son's analytical abilities were translating into practical skills that could prove essential for managing threats that exceeded normal civilian experience. Military training had taught Marcus that survival often depended on intellectual adaptability rather than just physical capabilities or weapons proficiency. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted their planning, federal aircraft arriving with the kind of rapid response that indicated Agent Chun's investigation had been designated high priority by agencies whose resources far exceeded typical field operations. Through infrared detection equipment, Marcus could see hostile surveillance, personnel retreating toward vehicles that would allow rapid departure once federal presence made their mission impossible to complete. Federal response arriving now, Agent Chun transmitted, her coordination with tactical support, demonstrating the serious nature of threats that had been developing around Operation Sterling discoveries. Maintain secure positions until perimeter is established and hostile parties have been cleared from your immediate vicinity. Tyler documented federal response procedures with systematic precision that impressed Marcus while creating permanent records of security events that could provide evidence for legal proceedings if criminal organizations attempted retaliation. Through other channels, his notebook had become a comprehensive archive of their entire investigation, from initial aircraft discovery through current threat response. Dad, the surveillance equipment detected data transmission from the hostile positions before they withdrew, Tyler reported, his analysis of electronic signatures revealing that their family situation had been reported to other parties whose interest in Operation Sterling materials might trigger additional threats that federal protection couldn't completely prevent. Someone else knows about our discovery and the federal response. Marcus understood the implications immediately, recognizing patterns that suggested coordinated criminal activity involving multiple cells or organizations whose operations had been developed specifically for situations where valuable assets became accessible through civilian discoveries that official channels couldn't control completely. The Hartwell family had become targets in conflicts that extended far beyond their understanding or capability to manage independently. Federal tactical teams secured the perimeter within minutes, their professional deployment demonstrating resources that provided immediate safety, while highlighting the serious nature of threats that civilian families faced when their discoveries intersected with criminal operations that had been operating since World War II. Agent Chun emerged from one of the helicopters with additional federal personnel whose presence indicated investigation escalation to levels that involved national security considerations. The surveillance team withdrew when our aircraft appeared, but electronic intercepts confirmed they transmitted detailed information about your discovery and our response procedures. Agent Chun reported, her federal intelligence revealing ongoing threats that would require extended protection measures rather than simple emergency response. Marcus Tyler, your safety now depends on federal custody until we can neutralize organizations whose interest in Operation Sterling poses continuing danger. Tyler looked at his father with expressions that revealed understanding of how their systematic investigation had transformed their family's financial crisis into survival situation that required federal protection from threats they couldn't have anticipated when their pond drainage project began. Their discovery had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, while creating dangers that exceeded their ability to manage through civilian resources. What about the farm? Tyler asked, his concern for their family's agricultural heritage extending beyond immediate personal safety to include preservation of property that represented 4 generations of Hartwell dedication to rural Tennessee. Land that had shaped their family's identity and provided their economic foundation. Federal protection includes property security until threat assessment determines safe conditions for normal residents. Agent Chun assured them, her agency's resources extending to comprehensive protection that acknowledged civilian families' needs for maintaining their lives and property while investigations resolved criminal threats that had been developing for decades. As federal personnel established security perimeters around the Hartwell farm and began evidence recovery operations that would preserve Operation Sterling materials while protecting the family from retaliation by criminal organizations, Marcus realized that their discovery had achieved exactly what they'd hoped while creating exactly what they'd feared. Tyler's college education would be secured through federal compensation programs. Their farm would be protected through government agencies, and their family's future would be guaranteed through resolution of historical mysteries that had frustrated professional investigators for 70 years, but achieving those goals had required accepting federal custody and protection from threats that connected their rural Tennessee farm to international criminal networks, whose operations posed continuing danger to anyone who interfered with illegal enterprises that had been generating profits from Nazi treasure for multiple generations. Success had come with prices that civilian families couldn't have anticipated when their simple pond drainage project had begun. The confrontation that would determine whether justice or criminal conspiracy prevailed came at dawn, when federal tactical teams surrounded a nondescript warehouse in nearby Cookville, where electronic surveillance had traced the overnight communications from the hostile surveillance team. Agent Chun stood beside Marcus and Tyler in the FBI command vehicle, watching through real-time video feeds as agents prepared to raid facilities that had been operating since 1947 as a front for Nazi treasure distribution networks that had evaded prosecution for 7 decades. Operation Sterling wasn't just about protecting Allied assets, Agent Chun explained, her voice tight with the controlled anger that came from understanding how her grandfather's sacrifice had been exploited by criminal organizations that had profited from wartime chaos while military families received incomplete information about their loved ones' final missions. Our investigation revealed that some aircraft were deliberately diverted to civilian facilities where Nazi collaborators could access cargo that was supposed to remain under military control. Marcus watched tactical displays that showed the warehouse complex contained sophisticated security systems and underground storage facilities that exceeded typical commercial requirements, suggesting long-term operations that had been designed to conceal valuable assets while maintaining legitimate business facades that allowed criminal activity to continue undetected by local law enforcement agencies. The warehouse is registered to Heritage Recovery Services, a company that's been operating antique and estate sales for 40 years. Agent Chun continued, federal databases revealing corporate structures that had been established specifically to provide legitimate cover for illegal asset distribution operations. But financial analysis shows revenue streams that don't match documented inventory, suggesting they've been selling high-value items that were never legally acquired. Tyler studied intelligence reports on his tablet, his analytical abilities, allowing him to process complex criminal network structures with systematic thinking that impressed federal agents, whose professional training hadn't prepared them for teenage investigators whose capabilities exceeded many adult consultants. His documentation of their pawn discovery had provided evidence that connected current criminal activity to historical events that official investigations had never fully resolved. The company's ownership structure includes multiple shell corporations that trace back to individuals whose families emigrated from Germany between 1945 and 1950. Tyler observed, his research revealing patterns that suggested deliberate coordination between wartime criminals and post-war immigration programs that had allowed Nazi collaborators to establish operations in American communities where their backgrounds wouldn't attract suspicion. Agent Chun nodded with grim satisfaction as Tyler's analysis confirmed federal suspicions about heritage recovery services that had been developing for years without sufficient evidence to justify the kind of comprehensive investigation that civilian discovery had finally made possible. The Hartwell family's aircraft had provided the missing link that connected modern criminal activity to wartime asset theft that had never been properly prosecuted. Our financial investigation shows Heritage Recovery has been selling uncut diamonds and precious stones that match the mineralogical profiles of assets that disappeared during Operation Sterling missions, Agent Chen said. Federal Laboratory analysis providing scientific evidence that linked current criminal inventory to military cargo that had been reported lost during classified operations 70 years earlier. Marcus felt military training engage as he recognized operational patterns that suggested Heritage Recovery Services had been more than simple criminal enterprise. It represented institutional conspiracy that had been protecting Nazi treasure, networks through legitimate business facades while corrupting local officials who had been paid to ignore suspicious activities that exceeded normal commercial operations. The warehouse raid began with precision that demonstrated federal capabilities when agencies focused maximum resources on resolving cases that involved national security implications and international criminal networks. Through command vehicle monitors, Marcus watched tactical teams penetrate security systems that had been designed to protect valuable assets from law enforcement discovery, while maintaining operational capacity for ongoing criminal distribution. Warehouse security includes motion sensors, pressure-sensitive flooring, and automated alarm systems that connect to private security companies rather than local police. The tactical commander reported, his team's analysis revealing defensive measures that exceeded typical commercial requirements, while falling short of military-grade protection that would have indicated government involvement in heritage recovery operations. Tyler documented federal procedures with systematic precision that created permanent records of law enforcement activities while preserving his family's connection to investigation that had achieved breakthrough results through civilian discovery rather than professional intelligence work. His notebook had become comprehensive archive of Operation Sterling, resolution that would provide historical documentation for events that had been classified for diplomatic reasons. Basement levels contain climate-controlled storage facilities with inventory management systems that track high-value items through database connections to international auction houses and private collectors. Agent Chun transmitted from Tactical Command, her investigation revealing distribution networks that had been operating across multiple countries while avoiding detection through sophisticated money laundering and legitimate business integration. Marcus recognized patterns that indicated Heritage Recovery Services had been functioning as more than regional criminal operation. It represented international conspiracy that had been coordinating with similar organizations throughout North America and Europe to distribute Nazi treasure through legitimate market channels that had allowed stolen assets to be sold to unsuspecting collectors while generating massive illegal profits. The inventory databases contain records dating back to 1947, including detailed provenance documentation for items that were supposedly destroyed during wartime bombing or lost during military operations. Agent Chun continued. Federal computer specialists revealing evidence that connected heritage recovery directly to Operation Sterling cargo that had been reported missing in official military records. Tyler's analysis of database structures revealed systematic approaches to criminal documentation that had allowed heritage recovery to maintain detailed records of illegal operations while providing sufficient legitimate cover to avoid law enforcement suspicion during routine business investigations that hadn't been designed to detect sophisticated international conspiracy. Their records include specific references to aircraft, OS-47 Delta, and cargo manifest numbers that match the documentation we recovered from Corporal Chun's personal effects. Tyler reported, his systematic cross-referencing providing evidence that definitively connected heritage recovery services to the aircraft in their family pond while proving criminal knowledge of military operations that had been classified for national security reasons. Agent Chun's voice carried controlled emotion as she realized that Tyler's investigation had provided evidence that could finally bring justice for military personnel whose sacrifice had been exploited by criminal organizations that had profited from wartime chaos while families received incomplete information about their loved ones' final missions and ultimate fate. Federal seizure teams are recovering inventory that includes uncut diamonds, precious stones, and historical artifacts that match descriptions from multiple Operation Sterling manifests. The tactical commander reported his teams discovering evidence that represented the largest recovery of Nazi treasure in American law enforcement history while vindicating federal investigations that had been pursuing these criminal networks for decades. Marcus watched evidence recovery procedures that revealed the scope of Heritage Recovery's criminal operations, understanding that their family's pond discovery had exposed international conspiracy that had been generating illegal profits while corrupting local officials and legitimate businesses that had provided cover for activities that should have been prosecuted immediately after the war's conclusion. Database records indicate Heritage Recovery has been coordinating with similar operations in 12 different states, suggesting national network that has been distributing Nazi treasure through legitimate auction houses and private collectors who were unaware they were purchasing stolen historical artifacts. Agent Chun said, federal analysis revealing criminal conspiracy that exceeded regional operations to include national coordination of illegal asset distribution. Tyler documented evidence recovery with methodical precision while processing the implications of criminal network structures that had been operating in rural Tennessee communities for decades without detection by local law enforcement agencies, whose resources hadn't been adequate for investigating sophisticated international conspiracy that had been designed specifically to avoid official attention. The financial records show Heritage Recovery has generated over $200 million in illegal revenue since 1947, Agent Chun announced. Federal accounting specialists revealing the massive scope of criminal profits that had been extracted from Nazi treasure distribution while military families never received compensation for their loved ones' sacrifice or complete information about classified operations that had cost American lives. Marcus felt satisfaction surge through his concern as he understood that their family's discovery had achieved justice for military personnel whose service had been exploited by criminal organizations while providing evidence that would finally allow prosecution of international conspiracy that had evaded accountability for 7 decades through corruption and legitimate business facades. The Heritage Recovery Warehouse contained evidence rooms that revealed systematic criminal operations involving multiple generations of family members who had inherited Nazi treasure distribution networks from relatives who had collaborated with enemy forces during World War II, before emigrating to American communities where their backgrounds wouldn't attract suspicion from local authorities. Arrest warrants are being executed simultaneously in multiple states for individuals whose families have been operating heritage recovery subsidiaries since the immediate post-war period. Agent Chun reported, federal coordination providing comprehensive response to criminal networks that had been protected by legitimate business integration and local corruption that had prevented effective prosecution through normal law enforcement channels. Tyler watched federal operations that validated his systematic approach to historical investigation, while demonstrating how civilian discovery could achieve breakthrough results that professional intelligence agencies had been seeking for decades without success. His analytical abilities had provided evidence that connected current criminal activity to wartime conspiracy in ways that institutional investigations had been unable to accomplish through official channels. As federal teams completed evidence seizure operations and began processing criminal arrests that would dismantle international Nazi treasure networks that had operated since 1947, Marcus realized that their family's pawn discovery had achieved more than financial security or historical resolution. They had provided justice for military personnel whose sacrifice had been exploited, while exposing criminal conspiracy that had corrupted American communities for generations. Agent Chun approached their command vehicle with evidence containers that held materials recovered from heritage recovery facilities, her expression carrying satisfaction that came from finally achieving justice for her grandfather and other Operation Sterling personnel whose families had never received complete information about their final missions or ultimate sacrifice for classified operations that had shaped post-war reconstruction. Marcus Tyler, your discovery has provided evidence that will result in prosecution of criminal networks that have been operating since World War II. Agent Chun said, her federal investigation achieving resolution that honored military service, while exposing conspiracy that had exploited wartime chaos for illegal profit. Your family's systematic investigation accomplished what federal agencies had been trying to achieve for 70 years. 6 months after the heritage recovery raids dismantled the largest Nazi treasure network in American history, Marcus stood in the conference room of Hartwell Historical Research Institute, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as construction crews completed the final phases of a state-of-the-art facility that would serve as the National Center for Investigating World War II asset recovery and providing closure for military families whose loved ones had been lost during classified operations. The Institute represented more than architectural achievement. It was proof that civilian discovery could triumph over institutional secrecy when guided by systematic investigation and unwavering commitment to historical truth. Federal compensation for the Hartwell family's aircraft discovery had exceeded $30 million, but Marcus had insisted that the majority of funds be dedicated to establishing research facilities that would help other families find answers about relatives whose military service had been classified for diplomatic reasons that no longer justified continued secrecy. Tyler emerged from the Institute's Advanced Computer Laboratory wearing the Massachusetts Institute of Technology sweatshirt that had arrived with his full scholarship acceptance letter, his analytical abilities having impressed federal investigators enough to secure recommendations that guaranteed admission to the nation's most prestigious engineering program. At 18, he had become the youngest consultant in FBI history, his systematic approach to historical investigation earning respect from professional agents whose training hadn't prepared them for civilian researchers whose capabilities exceeded many adult experts. Dad, the Department of Defense called about expanding our investigation protocols to include Korean War and Vietnam-era classified operations, Tyler announced, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had characterized all his academic achievements since their pawn discovery had transformed their family circumstances from financial desperation to institutional leadership and historical research. Apparently, our methodology for connecting civilian discoveries to military records has applications for resolving other cases that have been pending for decades. Marcus smiled at his son's continued dedication to helping military families find closure, understanding that Tyler's motivation extended beyond academic excellence to include personal commitment to honoring service members whose sacrifice had been classified or deliberately obscured by agencies whose priorities had emphasized diplomatic convenience over family notification. The Heritage Recovery investigation had revealed systematic patterns of institutional secrecy that had affected thousands of families across multiple generations. "What kind of expansion are they proposing?" Marcus asked, though his experience with federal agencies suggested that success often created opportunities for additional responsibility that could either enhance their institute's impact or overwhelm civilian resources with bureaucratic complexity that exceeded their capability to manage effectively. Tyler consulted his tablet, which displayed federal proposals that outlined comprehensive programs for applying their civilian discovery methodology to classified operations that had generated incomplete family notification across multiple military conflicts. The Department of Defense had recognized that institutional approaches to historical investigation often missed evidence that civilian researchers could identify through systematic analysis of local records and geographical surveys. They want to establish regional research centers that would coordinate between federal agencies and civilian investigators, using our pond discovery as a model for how local knowledge can resolve mysteries that professional intelligence operations couldn't solve through official channels, Tyler explained. His analysis revealing federal recognition that the Hartwell family's success had demonstrated the value of combining institutional resources with civilian analytical capabilities. Agent Chun entered the conference room carrying federal documents that outlined the broader implications of heritage recovery prosecutions. Her investigation having resulted in criminal convictions that had dismantled international networks while recovering assets worth over $400 million that had been stolen from resistance movements and concentration camp victims. During World War II, her personal satisfaction at achieving justice for her grandfather had been matched by professional recognition that civilian cooperation could produce breakthrough results that traditional federal investigations had been unable to accomplish. The heritage recovery prosecutions have revealed connections to similar operations in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries. Agent Chun reported, her FBI investigation expanding into international coordination that would recover Nazi treasure that had been distributed through legitimate business facades across multiple continents. Foreign governments are requesting assistance with applying your family's discovery methodology to historical mysteries that have been frustrating their own intelligence agencies. Marcus felt pride surge through his amazement as he realized that their simple pond drainage project had initiated international cooperation that would provide closure for military families worldwide, while exposing criminal networks that had been exploiting wartime chaos for illegal profit across multiple generations. The Hartwell Institute represented American leadership in historical justice that honored military sacrifice while demonstrating democratic values through transparency and family-centered investigation. How extensive is the international interest? Marcus asked, understanding that global expansion could either amplify their institute's impact or create diplomatic complications that civilian organizations weren't equipped to navigate without careful coordination with federal agencies whose authority extended to international criminal prosecution and asset recovery operations. Agent Chun spread intelligence reports across the conference table, revealing the scope of heritage recovery's international connections and the criminal networks that had been coordinating Nazi treasure distribution through legitimate businesses that had operated in rural communities where local law enforcement lacked resources to investigate sophisticated financial crimes that exceeded regional jurisdiction and expertise. Intelligence agencies in 14 countries have identified heritage recovery subsidiaries that were operating similar asset distribution networks. Agent Chun explained, federal coordination revealing criminal conspiracy that had been generating illegal profits while corrupting local officials and legitimate businesses that had provided cover for activities that should have been prosecuted immediately after the war's conclusion. Tyler documented international developments with systematic precision that had become his trademark approach to complex investigation. His notebook expanding to include global implications of their family discovery, while maintaining focus on practical applications that could help other civilian families achieve similar breakthrough results through methodical research and federal cooperation. The international investigations have recovered over $1,200 million in stolen assets, but more importantly, they've provided closure for approximately 8,000 military families whose relatives had been reported missing during classified operations, Agent Chun continued, her voice carrying satisfaction that came from understanding how civilian discovery had initiated justice that extended far beyond individual family resolution to include systematic accountability for wartime criminal activity. Marcus understood the broader implications of international recognition that positioned American civilian research as a model for democratic approach to historical investigation, demonstrating that transparency and family-centered methodology could achieve better results than institutional secrecy that had protected criminal networks while denying closure to families whose loved ones had sacrificed their lives for classified operations. Through the Institute's windows, the restored Hartwell farm looked different than it had 18 months earlier, when financial desperation had forced them to drain their pond in hopes of creating agricultural opportunities that might prevent foreclosure. The farmland had been designated a National Historic Site, its significance recognized through federal programs that provided permanent protection while generating tourism revenue that supported rural Tennessee economic development. Tyler, the Veterans Administration called about your scholarship research project, Marcus said, producing federal correspondence that outlined Tyler's systematic investigation of disability compensation procedures that had been denying benefits to veterans whose service-related injuries weren't adequately documented through military medical records that had been classified or destroyed during bureaucratic transitions. Tyler's analysis of Veterans Administration procedures had revealed institutional patterns that had been denying legitimate claims through administrative complexity that exceeded veterans' ability to navigate without legal assistance that most disabled personnel couldn't afford. His civilian perspective had identified systematic problems that federal agencies had been unable to recognize through internal review procedures that had been designed to protect institutional efficiency rather than ensure veteran welfare. The preliminary analysis shows that approximately 40,000 veterans have been denied disability compensation due to missing documentation that was classified or destroyed, but their medical conditions can be verified through family records and local hospital archives that federal investigators hadn't considered accessing. Tyler reported his research methodology proving applicable to bureaucratic problems that extended far beyond historical investigation to include ongoing institutional failures that were affecting military families' current welfare. Marcus felt familiar recognition of institutional patterns that prioritized administrative convenience over individual justice, understanding that Tyler's analytical abilities were revealing systematic problems that required the same kind of methodical investigation that had resolved their Operation Sterling mystery while exposing Heritage Recovery's criminal network operations. Agent Chun reviewed Tyler's Veterans Administration research with growing interest, recognizing applications for federal law enforcement that could resolve other cases where institutional secrecy had prevented civilian families from accessing benefits or information that they deserved based on their relatives' military service and sacrifice for classified operations that had shaped national security policy. Tyler's methodology could be applied to resolving benefit claims for families whose relatives served in intelligence operations, special forces missions, and experimental programs that were classified for national security reasons. Agent Chun observed federal recognition extending Tyler's civilian research into ongoing policy applications that could provide immediate assistance for veterans and military families whose circumstances had been complicated by institutional secrecy. As afternoon settled over the Hartwell Institute, Marcus realized that their family's pawn discovery had achieved transformation that extended far beyond financial security or personal recognition to include systematic change in how democratic societies approached military history and family welfare. Their civilian methodology had demonstrated that transparency and methodical investigation could produce better results than institutional secrecy that had been protecting criminal networks, while denying justice to families whose loved ones had served with distinction. Tyler prepared for his departure to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where his federal scholarship would support advanced studies in systems, engineering, and historical analysis that would enhance his capability to develop civilian research methodology for application to complex institutional problems that affected military families and democratic accountability worldwide. Dad, the Heritage Recovery Investigation recovered enough stolen assets to establish research institutes in 12 different countries, Tyler said, his voice carrying satisfaction that came from understanding how their family's systematic investigation had initiated international cooperation that would provide closure for military families while exposing criminal networks that had been exploiting wartime chaos for multiple generations. Marcus nodded with deep satisfaction as he considered how their simple pond drainage project had transformed into international movement for historical justice that honored military sacrifice while demonstrating that civilian discovery could achieve breakthrough results when guided by systematic investigation and unwavering commitment to truth rather than institutional convenience or diplomatic expediency. Through the Institute's windows, Riverside County looked different than it had when financial desperation had forced them to consider selling their family farm to satisfy medical bills and mortgage payments that had accumulated during years of agricultural struggle and bureaucratic complexity. The region had become a center for historical tourism and democratic education that provided economic opportunities while honoring American values of transparency and family-centered investigation. The aircraft that had waited 70 years beneath their pond water had finally provided the closure that Agent Chun's family deserved, while exposing criminal conspiracy that had corrupted rural communities through legitimate business facades that had concealed Nazi treasure distribution networks. But more importantly, their discovery had proven that ordinary families could achieve extraordinary results when guided by systematic thinking and commitment to justice that transcended individual benefit to include service for other families whose circumstances required similar dedication and methodical investigation. Tyler's notebooks, which contained comprehensive documentation of their entire investigation from initial pond drainage through international criminal prosecution, would be preserved at the Institute as historical records that demonstrated how civilian discovery could resolve mysteries that had frustrated professional investigators for decades through institutional approaches that had emphasized secrecy over transparency and bureaucratic efficiency over individual justice. As the sun set over Tennessee mountains that had witnessed 4 generations of Hartwell family dedication to rural agricultural life, Marcus understood that their greatest achievement hadn't been financial recovery or institutional recognition, but rather the proof that cooperative investigation could triumph over criminal conspiracy when guided by systematic analysis and unwavering commitment to honoring military sacrifice through family-centered research that prioritized truth over convenience and justice over diplomatic expediency. The Hartwell Historical Research Institute hummed quietly with activities that would help other families achieve similar breakthrough results, carrying forward the principle that democratic societies achieve their highest potential when civilian capabilities were combined with institutional resources to serve families whose loved ones had sacrificed their lives for classified operations that deserved recognition rather than continued secrecy. Their pond had been drained, but the discoveries it had revealed would continue providing closure and justice for generations of military families whose service had been classified for reasons that no longer justified denial of the truth they deserved to know. 5 years later, Tyler stood at the podium of the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, presenting evidence that had emerged from the Hartwell Institute's systematic investigation of Nazi treasure networks across 17 countries. His presentation displayed satellite imagery of underground facilities that had been operating since 1947, financial records that traced stolen assets through multiple generations of criminal families, and testimony from elderly survivors who had finally received compensation for property that had been looted during concentration camp deportations. The Heritage Recovery Network represents the largest criminal conspiracy in modern history, Tyler announced to an audience that included diplomats, historians, and family members whose relatives had been victims of wartime theft that had funded illegal operations for 7 decades. But their downfall began with a simple farm family who refused to accept that their pond couldn't be drained and their financial problems couldn't be solved through honest work and systematic investigation. Marcus watched from the gallery with Agent Chun, whose promotion to Assistant Director of the FBI's International Art Crime Division had been based largely on her success in coordinating civilian discovery with federal resources to achieve breakthrough results that professional intelligence agencies had been seeking for generations without success. Her grandfather's sacrifice had finally been honored through prosecution of criminals who had profited from his death while his family had been denied closure for 8 decades. The tribunal's chief prosecutor presented final evidence that included detailed documentation of Heritage Recovery's coordination with similar networks in Canada, Mexico, Argentina, and several European countries where Nazi collaborators had established legitimate businesses that concealed stolen asset distribution operations. The criminal conspiracy had generated over $14 billion in illegal profits while corrupting local officials and financial institutions that had provided cover for activities that should have been prosecuted immediately after the war's conclusion. The defendants before this tribunal represent systematic criminality that has affected thousands of families whose loved ones were murdered for their property, which was then distributed through networks that continued operating in democratic societies where their activities should have been impossible. The prosecutor continued, his presentation including photographs of heritage recovery facilities that had been disguised as antique shops, estate sale companies, and auction houses in rural American communities where local law enforcement had lacked resources to investigate sophisticated financial crimes. Tyler's testimony described the civilian research methodology that had been adopted by historical investigation programs in 43 countries, his systematic approach to local records and geographical analysis providing breakthrough results for cases that had frustrated professional investigators, whose institutional training had emphasized classified documents over community knowledge and federal resources over family-centered investigation. Military families deserve truth about their relatives' sacrifice, regardless of classification levels that were established for diplomatic convenience rather than legitimate national security requirements, Tyler explained, his voice carrying authority that came from 5 years of successful investigation that had provided closure for over 30,000 families whose loved ones had been lost during classified operations across multiple military conflicts. Agent Chun joined Tyler at the podium to present federal analysis of Heritage Recovery's American operations, her investigation revealing systematic corruption that had involved local sheriff departments, county commissioners, and state banking. Officials who had been paid to ignore suspicious financial activities that exceeded normal commercial operations, while generating massive illegal profits for criminal networks. The heritage recovery prosecutions have resulted in criminal convictions for over 400 individuals, whose families had been operating Nazi treasure distribution networks since the immediate post-war period. Agent Chun reported her federal coordination producing the largest asset recovery in law enforcement history, while demonstrating American leadership in international criminal prosecution and historical justice. Marcus felt deep satisfaction as he watched Tyler and Agent Chun present evidence that vindicated their family's systematic approach to historical investigation while honoring military personnel whose sacrifice had been exploited by criminal organizations that had corrupted democratic societies through legitimate business facades and local corruption that had prevented effective prosecution through normal law enforcement channels. The tribunal's verdict included comprehensive asset forfeiture that would provide compensation for surviving family members of concentration camp victims, while funding historical research programs that would continue investigating classified military operations using civilian discovery methodology that had proven more effective than traditional institutional approaches to complex international criminal prosecution. This tribunal's work demonstrates that democratic societies achieve justice through transparency and civilian participation rather than institutional secrecy that protects criminal networks. The chief judge announced his verdict establishing international precedent for civilian involvement in historical investigation, while recognizing American innovation and combining federal resources with family-centered research methodology. Tyler returned to his position at the Hartwell Institute, where his systematic investigation programs had been expanded to include partnership with universities worldwide that were applying civilian discovery techniques to unresolved military cases from Korean War, Vietnam conflict, and contemporary operations where classification requirements had prevented complete family notification about personnel losses during missions that remained sensitive for ongoing diplomatic reasons. The Institute's success had attracted international recognition that positions civilian research as an essential component of democratic accountability, demonstrating that transparent investigation could achieve better results than institutional secrecy while honoring military service through family-centered programs that prioritized individual closure over bureaucratic convenience and diplomatic expediency. Marcus had been elected to Congress on a platform that emphasized veteran welfare and government transparency. His legislative initiatives requiring federal agencies to cooperate with civilian researchers whose methodology had proven superior to institutional investigation for resolving cases that involved missing personnel and classified operations whose continued secrecy served no legitimate national security purpose while denying closure to families whose loved ones had served with distinction. The heritage recovery prosecutions had established legal precedent that allowed asset forfeiture from criminal networks that had been operating through legitimate business facades, providing massive funding for veteran assistance programs and historical research initiatives that would continue helping military families achieve closure about relatives whose service had been classified for reasons that no longer justified institutional secrecy. Agent Chun's FBI division had been expanded to include permanent civilian consultation programs that applied Hartwell methodology to ongoing investigations, her success demonstrating that federal law enforcement achieved better results through cooperation with citizen researchers whose local knowledge and systematic analysis could identify evidence that professional agents might overlook through reliance on institutional procedures and classified information sources. As sunset approached over the Tennessee mountains where their investigation had begun with simple pond drainage, Marcus realized that their family's discovery had initiated transformation that extended far beyond individual success to include systematic change in how democratic societies approached military history, veteran welfare, and international criminal prosecution that honored sacrifice while ensuring accountability for exploitation that had corrupted communities across multiple generations. Tyler's final report to the International Tribunal included recommendations for applying civilian discovery methodology to ongoing cases worldwide. His systematic approach providing framework for resolving historical mysteries, while maintaining democratic principles of transparency and family-centered investigation that prioritize truth over convenience and justice over diplomatic complexity. Hartwell Farm had become a national historic site that attracted visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how ordinary families could achieve extraordinary results through systematic investigation and unwavering commitment to truth that transcended institutional limitations and bureaucratic complexity. The pond had been restored as a memorial to military personnel whose sacrifice had been honored through civilian discovery that exposed criminal exploitation while providing closure for families who deserved complete information about their loved one's final service. Their story had proven that democracy achieved its highest potential when civilian capabilities were combined with institutional resources to serve families whose circumstances required justice rather than continued secrecy, truth rather than diplomatic convenience, and systematic investigation rather than bureaucratic obstruction that had protected criminal networks while denying closure to those who had earned it through sacrifice and service that shaped democratic values and international justice. Discovery that had begun with financial desperation and pond drainage had transformed into international movement for historical accountability that would continue providing closure for military families while exposing criminal networks that had exploited wartime chaos for illegal profit across multiple generations. Their systematic investigation had achieved justice that honored democratic principles while demonstrating that civilian discovery could resolve mysteries that professional investigators had been unable to solve through institutional approaches that emphasize secrecy over transparency and bureaucratic efficiency over individual family welfare. If this incredible story of determination, family bonds, and the power of systematic investigation has inspired you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel because we have more amazing stories of ordinary people achieving extraordinary results through perseverance and dedication to truth. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you these powerful narratives that demonstrate how individual families can overcome institutional obstacles and achieve justice that seemed impossible until someone refused to accept that the truth was too buried to find. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that systematic investigation and unwavering commitment can triumph over any challenge, no matter how complex or deeply buried the answers might seem.